Thank you all for making it. I really appreciate this. Having Dr. Enos talk to our American thought class is a real high point of the year for me. Like, I'm very proud of this lecture we're about to get. I'm proud of the lecture he gave last year, and there's some versions of it online that I'm gonna share with you. I'm really proud of his recent book too. He has another one coming out, and if this class were a year long, we would definitely be reading it. He is a prominent military philosopher. He's a historian and he's an educational theorist. And these are really good backgrounds for our topics in American thought. He works on self-directed learning and leader development. He has a PhD in education from North Central University. He focused on the Army leader development model. His scholarly work is featured in the Modern War Institute, Infantry Magazine, and Small Wars Journal. He explores the intersection of Stoic philosophy and modern soldiering and American thought, and I would say like the American ethos. He has also, the book I mentioned is called Marching with the Spartans, and it's an exploration of Captain Alden Partridge's educational philosophies, the way Americans in military academies were taught about ethics and values. So we are right on topic, but he's actually going to lead us to new topics we very much need for this class. And let's give him a round of applause to.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. My name's Dr. Franklin Nannis, and we're going to talk about a very interesting character in history called Cato the Younger. Very, very important to kind of understanding how America got started. He becomes really this idol, or out of a flawed Roman, he's shaped and reshaped through time to help people have an image to really advance societies forward. Next slide, please. Well, I appreciate Dr. Baker for introducing me so well. She pretty much covered my background. A couple notes is I am a militia officer, so I've served almost 20 years in the Nebraska National Guard. I work up in Arlington, Virginia at the National Guard Bureau now, and I got yelled at by my last supervisor for not saying it, but I'm a medical service corps officer. So broad background, broad experience that I bring here. With that being said, nothing I say here has been vetted by the Department of War. Everything I say here is going to be my own personal opinions and not that of the military or government. Next slide, please. So what we'll be talking today about is the history of Cato the Younger and how his image gets modified through time. So we'll talk about his life. We'll give you a little bit more about Stoic philosophy, the way he would have framed his life. We'll talk about his death in defiance of Julius Caesar. And then we'll talk about how kind of this flawed man gets reshaped through history. We'll talk about some changes of philosophy that occur in the 16th century to recreate Stoicism. And that will lead us into the effects on the American Revolution and really sparking some of the American Revolution. And then we'll ask some interesting questions. Anyone in here like hiking? Anyone hiked the Appalachian Trail before? So there's a question of how much Cato had to play in the establishment of the Appalachian Trail. And then we'll get into some kind of interesting ongoing debates as of today about the memory of Cato and how that intersects with the Confederacy and the Lost Cause movement. Before explaining why we've lost track of Cato and Stoicism, because of changes in education. And then we'll conclude with some questions moving forward. Next slide, please. So before we start, I have to tell of an important change that happened in Roman society 12 years before Cato was born, and that's the military reforms of Gaius Marius, probably the largest mistake in the Roman Republic, and it led to the downfall of the Roman Republic and the establishment of the Roman Empire. It was something that was tried to be prevented, but we've recreated it in America. But essentially, at the time, Rome was facing an enemy having difficulty getting enough soldiers, because at the time they depended on a militia system. So if you owned property or farm, you were required to bring your own armor, show up when you're called to war, go fight a war. And because you're stripping all your farmers or landowners out of your country, you didn't fight very long wars because they needed to get back to their farms to harvest and take care of food. Otherwise, you would harm your homeland by being in proactive wars. Gaius Marius had this idea, hey, we'll make a professional military, so the Roman Empire or Roman Republic will supply all the gear to the soldiers themselves. Anyone can be recruited into the military. Soldiers were promised land if they successfully served 25 years in the Roman military. So if you were poor, this was a way of getting property, getting a vote in the Roman Republic. And unfortunately, because of the establishment of a professional military, you had soldiers that understood that they could get wealth and a vote if they joined the military. They very quickly became more loyal to their commanders than to Rome because it was their commanders that would make them wealthy men and would give them more privileges in life, and they stopped caring about the will of the Roman Senate. And this is what will ultimately lead Caesar, or enough soldiers to have loyalty to Caesar to overthrow the Republic and establish a tyranny. Next slide, please. So we'll talk about this man called Marcus Porcius Cato, or better known as Cato the Younger, not to be confused with Cato the Elder, which was his great-grandfather. Cato the Elder was known for his kind of exceptional leadership as a consul of Rome during the war with Carthage, so fighting Hannibal. He was known for his austerity and his traditional Roman values. Poor Cato, when he was very young, at the age of 4, he loses both his parents. Both his parents die. He goes to live with one maternal uncle. He dies within a year. Then he gets passed off to another maternal uncle that's a Roman general and a politician. So from a very, very young age, he gets introduced to this military lifestyle and to a political lifestyle. His uncle invested pretty heavily into his education. So he went to various different scholars to learn Stoicism. He studied under an Epicurean, and then he also learned the theories of Aristotle for philosophy at a very young age. We do have some stories of him from his childhood. They're not believed to be totally reliable, but they do kind of foreshadow some of his character. He was really bad at school. It was really hard for him to learn, but he was kind of bold and courageous. They had a dictator named Sulla for a while in Rome, and when he was just a young kid, he said, hey, I can solve all these problems. All I need is a sword. I'm going to go assassinate the tyrant, which luckily they didn't hand the kid the sword. But it shows how bold he was and how sensitive and kind of driven to action to end tyranny even since childhood. Next slide, please. So as he grows older, Cato has a half-brother that he absolutely adores, older half-brother. Kind of his idol. His half-brother is in the military and he gets pulled into the war against Spartacus. So this is an uprising of slaves. He volunteers to go with his half-brother to go fight. The legion that they're in gets defeated twice, but Cato gets kind of recognized for his valor. So even though it was a defeat for the Roman legions here, Cato really stood out in terms of his courage. His commander attempts to have him decorated, and Cato basically says, hey, what I did wasn't good enough for these honors. That word got sent back to Rome that he was turning down military honors. It'd be like someone turning down the Bronze Star today. And that kind of started cementing his legacy of not only being bold and courageous, but being incredibly modest and not wanting kind of the laurels. He would go on to be elected a military tribune and go to Macedonia. He was known to be an exceptional commander. Even though he would be entitled to kind of rank and privilege and kind of a softer life as an officer, he lived the life of the average Roman soldier. So he became very famous in terms of walking, even when everyone else was riding on horseback, because the common soldier would walk. He ate very simple fare or meals, just like a very simple Roman soldier, and he was exceptionally just in terms of the treatment of his men. which made him a very great commander. So his men were exceptionally loyal to him because of the care that he took to them. Unlike his great-grandfather, who disliked kind of Greek philosophers, he would befriend another Stoic Greek philosopher and then carry him back to Rome to further study his education of Stoicism. His half-brother would die. He would make a very desperate attempt to get to the deathbed of his ailing half-brother. He arrived too late after his half-brother died. And this is a great example of separating him as a mythological character versus him as the real flawed character that he was. He threw this really big, lavish funeral for his half-brother, a man that he adored. Very unstoic behavior in terms of the amount of grief that he had and the way he expressed that grief with the death of his half-brother. Next slide. So as Cato comes back to Rome, he'll enter into kind of the more political side of the house. He'll be elected as a quaestor, which is like an auditor from the Rome. He is known to be kind of exceptionally gifted. He would go through and he would audit the accounts not only of how things are currently running in Rome, but he would go back into the historical accounts, audit years in the past, find corruption, prosecute people that had committed fraud against the Roman people. He was known as basically the unbribable politician of the day, which made him beloved by the people and maybe hated by the rest of the Senate. There's a very famous picture of him sitting alone during some debates about the Catiline conspiracy. So he was very much a man of principle that was led by those principles. We can question in history if he became too ideologically focused or too rigidly focused on some of the political decisions that he made. But ultimately, he became this great figurehead for the Roman Republic. He did do some things that we carry on in our own government today. He invented the concept of a filibuster. So there were some political actions that he disagreed with. So he understood that the Roman political machine is a bureaucracy. So he would just engage in bureaucracies for so long that would slow down the decision process of the Senate. So those decisions would be pushed into the future. He was a very staunch critic of Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar at the time was trying to gain as much power as he could. Julius Caesar very interestingly realizes that the head priest of Rome dies. He has two understudies that are going to war with each other. Julius Caesar realizes that if he bribes enough people in a three-way vote, he could possibly seize control of the position. So Caesar gets elected as the high priest of Rome during this period. There is an interesting gentleman named Catiline. He is running for consul of Rome. So he comes in, he attempts to get elected in one of the two highest positions of Rome. At the time, there was kind of an upstart politician named Cicero. Anyone know Cicero in here? So Cicero did things in traditional Roman political fashion. He wrote a whole bunch of treatises insulting kind of the character of Catiline. Because of this new man, Cicero, coming onto the stage, Catiline doesn't get elected to consul. So this very powerful man fails in his election attempts. So Catiline comes back in the next election cycle and says, well, basically, I'm either going to win the election or I'm going to overthrow Rome. So Catiline starts bribing people, and then he starts building a militia that if he fails to win the election, that he's just going to seize the town of Rome. That conspiracy to attack Rome was uncovered by Cicero. He has all the men involved in that arrested. Julius Caesar may or may not have actually been connected with that conspiracy theory. There's some debate on whether Cicero and Cato were trying to get him out of the political scene, or if Julius Caesar was really gifted at kind of distancing himself from a guilty party after they are captured. all these conspirators were brought before the Senate, and Roman citizens, even base level Roman citizens, didn't have a lot of rights. But the one right that every Roman citizen had is they had to have a trial before they were put to death. So the Senate couldn't sentence anyone to death without a trial. There becomes a big argument here that if they allow the gentlemen that were caught in the Catiline conspiracy to present evidence or have a trial in front of the Roman people, that trial will start a rebellion inside the Roman Republic. So there's a very famous debate on whether these men can be put to death without an official trial. So this would be an act that would break Roman law. And Caesar argues that they should have a trial and be sentenced to life in prison. Cato will argue that it's just to put these men to death. Julius Caesar will make it seem that Cato the Younger is violating the laws that Cato the Elder put into place. Ultimately, there was a vote, and these men would actually be executed. But this is really a really interesting and very politically defining event for Julius Caesar, for Cato, and for Cicero, and everyone involved. Kind of really interesting political debate, because Cicero would go around kind of lauding the fact that he saved the Roman Republic. The Senate would try to play down the impact of the conspiracy, because you never wanted to tell anyone that you almost got overthrown, so they had to kind of suppress the importance of it. It really marred the character of Cicero, caused a lot of political confusion in the middle of all this. Later on, Julius Caesar would go out and fight wars. Ultimately, he would come back, very famously cross the Rubicon and try to seize control of Rome itself. The other powerful military leader and politician of the time, Pompey, would flee to the south with loyal members of the Senate. And then Cato would join Pompey to begin the fight for the Roman Civil War that would go from Italy to the Mediterranean to Africa in a series of engagements. Next. So before we get to the death of Cato, I want to tell you a little bit more about the philosophy that he believed in. So he believed in a school called Stoicism, very famously founded by Zeno of Citium. Depending on which account you read, either he was a wealthy merchant that found Stoicism, then had a shipwreck, or he was a wealthy merchant that was shipwrecked and then found Stoicism, then found philosophy. But the moral of the story is he was an exceptionally wealthy man. He lost everything, but he said that through philosophy, his work, he found the true riches. So even though he had lost everything and became impoverished, he discovered kind of the real wealth that existed in the world. Stoicism believes that happiness, or the fulfillment of duty, was only found through virtue. It was a value-based philosophy that was dependent on wisdom or prudence, making good decisions, courage, which is fortitude, to do what's right, justice and morality, and then temperance, which is self-discipline. Next slide, please. Other tenets of the Stoic philosophy is they wanted to live in harmony with nature. So what they saw in nature, they tried to recuperate. They had this concept, which is kind of a term that would be applied backwards in time, but amore fati, which is the love of your fate. So no matter where you find yourself, love where you are at the moment. So if you're a poor man, then be happy in being poor. If you're a rich man, you can be happy in being rich. Kind of don't look around yourself. Don't compare yourselves to others. Just realize what you have in your control at the time, and you can find happiness in that. If you find yourself facing hardship, realize that your hardship that you're facing is a way of showing your personal excellence. So the worse your fortunes become, the better the person you get to become. So it's a rather beautiful philosophy in that regard. They also believed in this concept of the dichotomy of control. So it's really about focusing on the aspects of life that you can change and learning to accept the things that are outside of your control. that gets refined through the years. In modern philosophy, you would probably say there's a trichotomy of control, but it really is a philosophy that focuses on actions, on the things that you can control, and not stressing on the things that you can't. So I can't control how everyone in this room perceives me. I can't control my reputation, but I can control my own personal character. So no matter what you think of me in this room, I should focus on engaging in virtue and being a good person. And you could all disagree with that assessment, but that doesn't matter to me, because what matters to me is the things that I have in my control. Stoicism also used a lot of parallels with military lives. And one of the famous things they did was voluntary exposure to hardship. Epictetus would call this hard winter training. It's an illusion kind of in the eras of the Greeks. They didn't have the technologies we have today, so they don't have cold weather equipment like we have today. So in winter months, fighting would stop between countries, and a soldier that kept physically training in those winter months was better prepared for a spring offensive versus the guy that just went back to his house and took a vacation and wasn't preparing for the future battle. So a lot about Stoicism is constantly engaging in hardship. So, hey, if life isn't giving you challenge or giving you stress, now is the time for you to practice and build your own capacity to handle stress. So we see some of the things that Cato did out of Plutarch, but you exercise vigorously. You put yourself out in extreme environments, so you get used to walking around without a coat in the winter. You get used to walking around during the heat in the summer. You get used to walking and moving yourself long distances, kind of building your own personal endurance. There's other ways of doing Stoic toughening that aren't necessarily physical. So if you're a wealthy individual, one of the biggest fears for wealthy individuals is to become impoverished, to lose your fortune. So a form of Stoic toughening training would be maybe once a month you sleep on the floor and you eat. Try to figure out if you only can eat on $5 a day. And that will give you the experience of, hey, if I was homeless, this is kind of what my life would look like. And knowing if you could kind of live like that, one day a month, it's less scary because you'd realize, hey, I'd still be alive. I could still do things. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad if I lost my wealth. And it would remove the fear of losing your wealth in the stock market if you engaged in those routine practices. Unlike the current use of the term Stoicism in our contemporary language, Stoics didn't actually actively suppress their emotions. They understood that their emotions were just a natural response of the human body. Very famously, there was a Stoic sage on a ship that was in the middle of a storm, and everyone thought the ship was going to sink, and he looked like he was incredibly fearful. But the moral of the story is when they took him to shore and asked him, well, why were you frightened? And that was the correct thing to do at the time, was to be frightened. But the Stoics would also encourage you to reflect back on your experience to determine if you were experiencing the correct emotion at the time. A lot of times we get into an experience, we have this kind of visceral emotional reaction, but if we reflect after the experience, we may realize that our perceptions of that experience were wrong. So if I'm walking down a street and I walk across Dr. Baker, I wave to her, she doesn't wave to me, I think, oh no, something happened to our friendship. I get sad versus, oh, Dr. Baker was probably thinking about the lecture. She probably didn't notice me and she probably wouldn't have ever meant me offense. So a lot of constant revision, trying to figure out if you had the correct perception about what was going on. Next slide. Okay, back into the life of Cato. So Pompey would go off and famously get defeated when facing the forces of Julius Caesar. Cato asked him to travel with him to the Battle of Pharsalus. If Cato was there, the battle might have ended differently because he would probably have been more aggressive. But Cato's a good soldier and he'll do what his commander says. Pompey would flee the defeated battlefield dressed as a civilian. He would seek safety in Egypt, but the Ptolemies put out a death sentence to him. So as soon as he arrived inside Egypt, he was murdered. Cato rallied the remnants of the Republican forces and marched them very famously through a 7-day forced march, so as fast as you can move through the deserts of northern Africa. Again, very famously, he'll march on foot, setting the example for the soldiers that march with him, very famously letting his soldiers drink before he had access to water himself. So caring for others before you look after yourself. Unfortunately, he would make it to a town called Utica. Republican forces under the commander of a descendant of a Scipio and a Numidian king named Juba would again engage with Julius Caesar's forces, be defeated. Julius Caesar had 4 legions currently on site. He had 6 other legions coming. It was an impossible fight. There was no way that you would ever win. Julius Caesar sends essentially word that he will officially pardon Cato if he surrenders. Cato realizes that a tyrant has no authority in the Roman Republic, therefore he can't pardon you. And Cato fears that if he accepts this and bends the knee, Julius Caesar is going to let him go sit in the Senate. And every time Julius Caesar, the tyrant, speaks, Cato will rail against the tyrant, and everyone will realize how kind and compassionate Julius Caesar is for not killing Cato, and all of Cato's kind of efforts would be lost and supplanted. So Cato very famously decides to commit suicide despite Julius Caesar, so that kind of live free or die mentality. And he escapes being used as a political pawn. Next slide. So Cato will prepare for death. He will famously read the book, the Phaedo, which is written by Plato, but it is the reflections of Socrates. So Socrates gets tried for corrupting the youth of Athens. He gets ordered to drink hemlock. It is the story of what Socrates has as a conversation right before he kills himself. During this process, he makes repeated requests to his servants to bring him his sword. They all love him so much that they attempt to not bring him the sword and delay every possible way. He gets so frustrated with one of them that he punches one of his servants. He breaks his hand in doing so. And then they finally bring him his sword. And then he famously says, "Finally, I am free," as he continues to read with his sword by his side. Everyone goes to bed that night. Sometime in the night, Cato will take his sword and stab himself into the stomach, and he will fall down and make a whole bunch of noise in the process. Next slide, please. Everyone will essentially come to the aid of the unconscious Cato. They will summon surgeons. The surgeons will come, replace his organs back in his body, and sew him up. Cato will regain consciousness, and understanding his situation will physically tear his own stomach open and disembowel himself. If anyone's ever studied medicine, the amount of nerve endings in your stomach is incredible. This is probably one of the most painful, brutal deaths that I could imagine. Very dedicated to his cause, I guess. This will immortally be remembered throughout time. If anyone wants a chance of catching up on Roman history through kind of a narrative or story form, I highly recommend Robert Harris's Cicero series. It's written from the viewpoint of Cicero's slave. You actually probably use some of the characters that Cicero's slave invented for writing quickly. But Ed Harris, interestingly, begs the question of if Cato's death was done symbolically as a form of haruspexy, which is the reading of organs. So Romans would sacrifice animals, read their organs before they go into battle to determine whether or not they should engage the enemy forces. Again, Julius Caesar had been elected the high priest of Rome. So by kind of spilling your guts, there's an interesting question of, was he showing the fate of the Roman Empire through his own guts by killing himself? Next slide, please. So very famously, if you're a successful military commander, the Senate can vote for you to receive what's called a triumph, which you march your men through Rome. You typically drag behind you the commanders in chains. that you defeated in combat, and then they would be ritually killed during that triumph. This was like kind of the ultimate glory to a military commander of Rome. Julius Caesar would triumph after winning the Civil War. You know, he'd paint his face red to make him look like the god of Mercury or the god of war. Since Cato killed himself and he couldn't be brought to the triumphs, Caesar had this huge banner of him painted that he carried through the crowd. And very famously, it's recorded that people, even that opposed Cato, saw this banner and booed at Julius Caesar. So it was relatively clear from the point of Caesar's triumph that he had lost the moral fight of this war, and probably had a far different effect than he had planned by carrying this banner. Next slide. So we have a gap kind of between the death of Cicero, or at least I should say, we have a gap in surviving materials. We have between the death of Cato and how that event gets reported. So kind of the first story that we have was written by a poet named Lucan, and he was attempting to copy Homer, the Greek poet. So he writes a poem called On the Civil War. It later gets retitled based on the character that only appears in the first book. There's some conversation of whether this play was finished or not. What we know of is we know of 10 of the likely 12 books that would have been written. Lucan was a poet under Nero. There is some debate on what happened between Lucan and Nero. The two stories are either Lucan had this play performed and then Nero called an emergency meeting, so everybody left Lucan's play. So Lucan wrote some very nasty things about Nero. That's one possible way Lucan got himself killed. Or the other way was Nero himself was not a strong emperor. So just recounting the story of an exceptional moral man was not in the favor of Nero. In either case, either Lucan committed suicide on order or was killed in a way that it appeared that he had committed suicide by the order of Nero. 10 years later, so about 120 years after the death of Cato, we get Plutarch. Plutarch isn't a historian, he's a moralist, so he writes about the great men of history in terms of their character, so it's not an exact telling of what happens over time. We believe that he was objective in his assessment of Cato, but very admiring in that regard. We do believe that he had firsthand information or materials of Cato's death, including that of Cato's uncle that actually adopted him. He would have still been a general in the Roman military at the time. And again, we see the shaping of Cato in that story to be more morally focused than kind of historically as a historical character. And as time progresses, Cato, the legacy of Cato will be more and more morally focused than kind of what actually happened as a flawed human being. Next slide, please. We do know that Julius Caesar wrote an anti-Cato. Julius Caesar was an exceptionally great writer, so it's kind of a detriment that we don't have a copy of this. We do know that Caesar actively attacked Cato's legacy and his philosophy. So he called him cold or unfeeling and miserly. He was trying to kind of shape the Stoic characteristics of Cato into a negative. However, Cicero, before the death of Cato, had written very much in compliment of Cato. So there are kind of conflicting histories of Cato during this time period. So we don't believe it was as effective as intended as kind of propaganda to smear Cato after Cato committed suicide. Next slide. So the Stoic philosophy itself as a school is going to die down around the 4th century AD. Essentially, Stoicism is a really great philosophy to deal with one of the major fears in mankind, which is the fear of death. with the advent of Christianity, it's a lot easier to believe in Jesus than it is to go through all these moral exercises to calm yourself down and think about kind of life after you die. So you see the fading away of Stoicism. But interesting enough, the impact of Cato is Cato will endure as an icon even after his philosophy has been largely erased or not practiced. Next slide, please. So very famously, Dante, anyone read the Divine Comedy in here? The very famous Italian poet, who kind of makes sense. He's so close to Rome, would remember Cato. But very famously, Dante puts Cato in as the guardian to purgatory. So he is literally the closest pagan to God that you could get. And Dante would say, what earthly man better represents God himself than Cato? And again, really, we see the focus here as Cato as kind of a moral character. Next slide. Cicero will have a collection of his works published shortly after the Gutenberg Bible is published, so in 1465. And in that, one of Cicero's work that gets published in an anthology is the Paradoxes of Stoicism. And in that work, which was written before the death of Cato, he really compliments Cato. Cato himself kind of becomes an evolution of Stoicism unto himself. So typically, Stoic philosophers are very cold and straightforward in how they present arguments, and they were very famously known not to elaborate or kind of appeal to emotion in the lectures because they were more logically focused. But Cato seemed to have adapted the more entertaining style of giving lectures. So Cicero really compliments the fact that he's a Stoic, but not one of those boring Stoics. He's like the new version of a Stoic. And then he actually compliments the virtue of Cato in here. So one of the very first printed works will refer back to Cato and keep it. So we have another philosophical tradition that will help bring back Stoicism. So there's a Flemish humorist, so near where Belgium is now, named Justus Lipsius. He would very, very famously write a book called On Constancy. There are characteristics in Stoicism that conflict with Christian theology. And what Justus Lipsius did was he went back in time and revised the Stoic philosophy, and he edited out anything in Stoicism that wasn't compatible with Christian theology. He really created the next evolution of philosophy. So one of the things that he took out is in Stoicism, Stoicism was deterministic. So you couldn't change your fate inside Stoicism. Like everything had already been predetermined to you. That doesn't work with Christian morality because you have to have the ability to have free will. So that's one of the major things that get edited out. He primarily works on the works of Seneca as a Stoic, but he sparks a movement for scholars across Europe to go into archives trying to find other Stoic philosophers that they basically can do the same type of effect with. So to revise Stoicism to be compatible with Christianity. That has a tremendous impact and even impacts us today. That will lead to a gentleman named Hugo Grotius, he basically writes the foundation of international law. He writes tracts that become really the establishment of modern rules of law. And like the Geneva Conventions are built on top of his work and his framing. Interesting enough, the very first kind of laws of war were to prohibit your soldiers from doing things that would hurt their own souls. So it's not that you shouldn't kill enemy civilians because it's bad and it'll make it harder to win the war. It's if you kill the civilians inside an enemy country, then God will not forgive you. You will not make it into heaven. Don't do this. It will cause a moral wound that's unforgivable. So we take a very different look on international law today than it was originally intended. Next slide. So what the Neo-Stoics did with virtue is they kept the old four Stoic or Platonic virtues, and they added into the Christian virtues. I also can say that you can believe in Stoicism without necessarily believing in Christianity. So they added faith, which is the recognition that God has a plan. So the non-theological version is you believe in cause and effect. So what I do will affect the outcome of what happens. Hope is non-theologically. We could say, hey, you need to be optimistic about things. Theologically, we would say that, hey, no matter what happens, even if evil happens, God will use that evil to shape some greater good. So it's an acceptance of life, but being hopeful that as you go through all the trials of life, it's building you into something better. Admiral James Stockdale there, which Dr. Baker has studied quite a bit, is credited of creating something called the Stockdale paradox, which is in his time in Hanoi Hilton during the Vietnam War and 7 years of as a POW, the Stockdale paradox says you can be brutally honest with everything you face in terms of life and trying to escape a POW camp and enduring torture, but you have to also be hopeful that you're going to be rescued. So no matter how bad things got, he always believed that he would either be able to escape or that America would come to retrieve him. And great stuff. I could go on and talk forever about him. There's charity or agape. That's essentially love. It's a self-sacrificial version of love, or how we think about love from a parent to a child is the last virtue. Next slide. So some features of the philosophy is we shouldn't be driven by passion, but by obedience to God. Freedom comes from through logic and reasoning. There's a belief that we're all mortal, so we have this kind of original sin from Christianity. So we're going to all have faults. Sin is part of the world. We're going to be imperfect, but hopefully God will use that imperfectness to shape kind of a perfect future. We have free will to make good choices, and then it stresses the use of compassion, which is empathy tempered by reason, and it values virtues over words. Famously, if you found the guy that was homeless on the street, you would quietly do something to help the guy, and you would not want to attract attention of you doing charity around you. So it's not about you doing great works and being recognized. It's about you doing good works to help your fellow man. Next slide. Oh, and Neo-Stoicism would lay the foundation of the Enlightenment and carry many of the kind of natural rights that John Locke would write into what would become our Constitution. So the reappearance of Cato as a main figurehead, and you'll see him kind of become a revolutionary in this regard. It happens around 1720. We'll have two British writers take up the cause of, or pen name of Cato. They will rail against the corruption inside the British government. They will warn against the standard or dangers of a standing army, again, wanting a militia. And then they will advance the idea of a blended government and that balance of powers, or essentially republicanism. This is an incredibly powerful work. It's believed that in the early days of the American Republic, half of the private libraries had copies of the Cato letters or some of the Cato letters. They very famously would use the phrase English rights instead of natural rights, which John Locke would use. So if you read the original Founding Fathers and see the reference to English rights, it's because of the influence of this work. Next slide. And then very famously, we would have the writing of a play called Cato the Tragedy. Joseph Addison would be commissioned by the Whig Party to write a play for their political purposes. He would write the first 4 or 5 chapters. Then he very famously would take another proposal, and then he would go gallivanting off across Europe, meeting with kings and writing other political commentary. He would come back to England, and his party would very kindly ask him to deliver the play that they had paid him for, and he finished the last act in a single week. It was performed for the first time in 1713, and it was an overwhelming success, and almost every political party in England thought it was written for them because everyone thought that they were Cato. It was such an impactful work. I don't think there's any comparable comparison in the 20th or 21st century. So this would be like Star Wars combined with Harry Potter combined with Lord of the Rings. Like everyone knew this work. Like there was not a single person that wouldn't understand the story. So many people will absorb it into their language. This would just become a reframing of how we would think about political relationships into our world. And I'll run through all the examples that I can show you of the founding fathers. Excellent. So Nathan Hale, he probably didn't say this because we probably didn't have Americans close enough to him when he got executed as an American spy, but it's very, very famously put out in the newspapers that he said, I have a regret that I have but one life to lose for my country. That's a reframing of a very similar quote from Addison's play. Next slide, please. We'd see Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. Again, we see this coming out of a paraphrase of Addison's play. That really helped spark the American Revolution. Next slide. George Washington. So before the American Revolution, he was fighting in the French and Indian Wars. He'd write home to his sweetheart, the love interest, and he would tell how horrific the battlefield was and how he wished that he was back home playing as a member of Cato. Interesting enough, he may have actually foreshadowed the American Revolution when he did it. He referenced he wanted to play the part of Juba, this Numidian king. The Numidian king, Cato, eventually agrees to give him the permission to marry his daughter, Marcia, because Juba adapts the way of Rome. So he adapts the philosophy of Stoicism, becomes a model of Roman virtue, even though he's not of Rome. So in a way, America is born in the same way. So we adapt kind of the virtues of Rome, but we are the new Rome. We're the foreigners that decide to act like Rome. In 1775, before Benedict Arnold will betray the country, George Washington uses a passage of Addison's play to complement the performance of Benedict on the battlefield. In 1777, 1778, when the army was encamped in Valley Forge and the U.S. Army was very close to being defeated, Washington allowed Cato a tragedy to be performed for his officer corps, even though it was against the law, because the Continental Congress says we don't have time for display or plays. They're a distraction from the fight or the war. You can imagine how powerful that would be for an army that's encamped, doesn't have enough food, freezing to death in some cases in the winter months, that they get showed a play that's basically, hey, we will fight to the death. And that's the only righteous thing to do is fight until you can't fight anymore. Inside the newspapers of the time or other writings, George Washington is frequently referred to as America's Cato. George III of England constantly gets referred to as Julius Caesar. Next slide. George Wythe, which is the mentor to Thomas Jefferson, will be referred to as the Cato of his country. Next slide. Samuel Adams, again, he'll also be referred to as America's Catos inside newspapers. I love the fact that he famously asked that Boston become a Christian Sparta. It's a different way of saying neo-Stoic in behavior. So hardy men focused on the true substance of life that follow a strict virtue system. Next slide. Okay, Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr will both refer to themselves as Cato in their argument with each other. Next slide. And it's not known for certain, but it's believed that George Clinton used the pen name Cato during the Anti-Federalist Papers. Even if he didn't, the Anti-Federalist Papers, the very powerful author named Cato, fighting for individual rights and for a militia over a standing military. Next slide. So what is Cato to the Americans is he's very much the symbol of the American Revolution. So he provides the standard through Plutarch and other historical works of what a battlefield commander should do, their behaviors towards their men. So a very down in the trenches leader. So like equality among men, even the leaders are going to endure the hardships of war. It carries on this meaning of demonstrating the fact that America is really going to fight to its death. There's only one way that this battle wins, is through victory or total defeat. There's no going back and being submissive to England. He sets the model for the ideal statesman, the uncorruptible statesman that can't be bribed. This idea of a hopeful future republic with honorable men leading us. And then he connects the fledgling country of America with exceptionally powerful imagery of this great Roman Republic in antiquity. Next slide, please. So a lot of scholars kind of leave off basically there on Cato's story, but if I was going to pick one man to call Cato after the American founding fathers, it would be this man, Captain Alden Partridge. He was the third superintendent of West Point. He would save West Point during the War of 1812. He would come into political conflict with the Monroe administration because he wants West Point to start training militia officers and doing their constitutional duty. Monroe wants to establish an imperial army very much in the model of Napoleon, so he will leave his military service and very famously go establish a private military academies throughout the country. Norwich is his military academy, but he's also influential in establishing VMI, and the Citadel are also built inside his model. His American education model would have taught every man how to be a militiaman during the course of their professional education. So we didn't need a large standing army. He was also famous for his long distance marching, hiking, and peak bagging, climbing and measuring mountains. Some interesting aspects of whether he got that directly from Cato or whether Thomas Jefferson inspired him to do it. Next slide, please. So like Cato, Partridge was said to be an exceptional horseman, but he refused to ride horses. This guy was incredibly gifted in marching. So I have historical accounts that he could walk before they invented trails, somewhere between 45 and 70 miles a day consistently, nonstop. In the 1830s, he would be published in the Journal of Health. He had the problem of American students were becoming crippled by their academies because we'd send young boys into college and they would sit and they would read by candlelight all these ancient texts and learn all these foreign languages, and they'd be crippled, their shoulders would roll forward, they wouldn't have any muscular strength, and they would need whatever splints or corsets later in life to hold them up straight because of their lack of physical development. We have the opposite problem now. We eat too much and we get all fat. But he recommended going out and walking 4 miles a day. So you like the first one to say, hey, get 10,000 steps per day of walking. But once a quarter, he would tell you to walk somewhere between 30 and 80 miles a day, climbing mountains and measuring the heights of mountains. And he believed if you did this, you would build your physical and mental constitution. He writes in this article about how he hasn't suffered any ill effects from going out, climbing mountains and being soaking wet for 6 days at a time and living on very simple, meager fare of a soldier. So this is very much copying the practice of Cato, or at least the Stoics. And then he would send all his measurements back to Thomas Jefferson, who was collecting the measurements of mountain ranges in America at the time. Next slide. Because of how Partridge was using marching, or he would use it at his academies, he actually invented the concept of field trips, essentially walking his cadets out to go see different industries while teaching them how to endure fatigue. At the turn of the 20th century, educator James B. Taylor realized through the stories like, hey, something needs to be done to preserve this type of space in Vermont so we can continue these practices. And he believed that he could make a very long trail through Vermont, which came to fruition through the Vermont Long Trail. Everybody walked on Vermont Long Trail here? No. Okay. Next slide. So very famously, Benton McKay would walk upon the long trail, and he would be on top of a mountaintop on the long trail, and he'd look further south, and he thought to himself, hey, we could just keep this trail going. So he was inspired to create the Appalachian Trail, and that trail itself passes through Partridge's hometown, where the original Norwich University was. Comes within half a mile of his gravesite. But many points on this trail actually were first walked by Partridge himself, or where Partridge was among the first to walk them, like Mount Washington. So there's a really interesting question here: that is the Appalachian Trail the greatest monument to Cato in America? And I would argue it is. If you read the blogs of the through hikers that march this, they talk very stoically about kind of facing the hardships and the unexpected kind of difficulties on the trail and learning from them. It's almost sad that they don't realize how much they're referring to Stoic philosophy as they journey along this trail. I very much wish that the 3 million Americans that walk this trail would understand better the philosophy that may have inspired this trail. So next slide. So now we'll bring Cato into the American Civil War. Next slide. Partridge in the 1820s looked at the Napoleonic Wars and realized that there was a French military academy. They got called into a battle and they performed like veteran troops. So they didn't perform like green troops, they performed like they had fought before. So when he was establishing military academies across the country, he said, hey, build these academies. They are your emergency fighting force, and if you ever need them, they can come to your rescue. And that's exactly what would happen here at the Battle of Newmarket. Partridge would actually help in terms of the writing campaign to establish VMI, the military academy in Lexington, Virginia. And then when General Breckinridge had to defend the Shenandoah Valley, he famously called out the cadets of the VMI. The intent was to keep them at the back of his formation, to make his army seem bigger. He did not ever intend to put them into combat. Unfortunately, the Union forces broke his lines in half, and he was forced to send in the cadets. And very famously, the cadets would charge by themselves and capture artillery pieces. They did not win the battle single-handedly, but they definitely helped win this war. Unfortunately, a couple weeks later, the Union Army would come back and they would even burn down their school in revenge for this last success in the valley. Next slide. This battle very much was walked in the footprints of Cato. So again, Partridge would take out his cadets to make sure that they understood the hardships of a soldier and being able to cover long distances in time, basically copying Cato's fourth march. The VMI cadets famously walked 80 miles within the 4 days prior to this battle and then went straight into the battle. And it's believed that the Union forces suffered a defeat because they were not accustomed to marching the same way the VMI cadets were. Next slide. So one of the cadets that was in this battle was a young 19-year-old named by Moses Jacob Ezekiel. He is a Jewish cadet, first Jewish cadet of VMI. His roommate, which is Thomas Garland Jefferson, the great grand-nephew of Thomas Jefferson, would be mortally wounded in this battle. Very famously and compassionately, Ezekiel would run back into town barefoot because he lost his shoes. He'd find a cart, get the cart, bring his best friend back to a house, and he would famously read the Bible to him over the course of his death, which took several hours for him to die. So just a lot of love and a lot of personal tragedy. There's a great movie that you can watch for free on YouTube called Field of Shoes that displays this battle. It's well worth your time. Next slide. So after the war, Ezekiel would study medicine, not really love it. He would try to run his family business. A fire would take his family business. And then Robert E. Lee would essentially encourage him to go back to doing art because he always wanted to do art. He would go over to Rome and become one of the famous artists of his era. He was actually compared to Michelangelo at the time. It's unfortunate now today that we know him basically as a lost cause artist, or a artist that really helped shape the memory of a Confederacy that really didn't exist. However, that may have actually been pressed against him. So he attempted to win several different competitions that represent Union leaders, but probably him as a Confederate veteran was always turned down. So he would go where the money would go. And so he ended up making lots and lots of artwork for the American South. Even the Republican President Harding, at the time of his death, would say he was a great Virginian, great artist, great American, and great citizen of the world. One of his most famous artworks is Virginia Mourning Her Dead. So this was inspired by him about 30 years after the end of the war, in memory of the 7 cadets that died in the battle he fought. He refused to accept payment for this monument. And there's some really interesting aspects of it. So George Wythe, which I referred back to, is Thomas Jefferson's mentor. He designed the seal of Virginia. And that seal of Virginia may actually recall Cato, because what you see there is a tyrant dressed in Roman armor that very easily could be Julius Caesar. Cato was very famous of wearing a simple toga without a tunic, and that's what we see Lady Virginia wearing. It's just a simple toga without a tunic. He captures that imagery in making that piece of art. The cadets that died in that battle have been reinterred at the base of this, or most of the cadets have been reinterred at the base of this monument. So if you ever go to VMI, right next to their parade field is the row of the cadets that died defending the school. So I can only imagine how powerful a monument that would be if I was a cadet attending that academy. Next slide. So we have this idea of a lost cause, which is really revisionist history and the history or attempt to revise history. So after the American Civil War, obviously the construct of slavery is morally repugnant to almost anyone that can think. But there's this idea that after the war, they could reshape the image of why the soldiers fought and maybe recast the Confederacies as the good guys and not maybe horrible guys. And we get into some very complicated and nuanced looks of history. So without a doubt, the secession that occurred between the states from the U.S. Republic that led into the American Civil War, that was all slavery, like primarily slavery. You would be hard-pressed to argue that states didn't leave for the sake of keeping their slaves. But that wasn't the reason why all states fought. And we do have some interesting examples of Virginia, the slave state, voted to stay with the Republic, knowing that they would have to sacrifice their slaves. But Lincoln called for 40,000 troops to invade into the South and maintain the Union. And once that occurred, Virginia said, hey, you've lost popular opinion. You can't use force to keep people inside the Republic. And that's when Virginia separated. I took 26 soldiers to Iraq with me, and I probably could name a dozen reasons why those soldiers went to Iraq. So if we were going to kind of create a bell curve of Confederate soldiers and said how many of them fought for slavery, maybe a majority of them fought to either keep slaves or reinforce kind of racial structures, but there were a tiny minority of Confederate soldiers that really fought for this construct of like, hey, you can't use violence to keep people in the Union. So there is a little bit of truth to the lost cause, which if you want to make propaganda, you need a little bit of truth in there. Just like in Union propaganda, when the first years of the war, we recruited soldiers to maintain the Republic. This was largely about keeping the country together, keeping the tax base, maintaining the economic system that we had. It was only several years into the war that we actually started recruiting soldiers to end slavery. So at a soldier level, why people fight wars is very, very complex. And if you ever have someone say that soldiers fight for one singular reason, they're almost entirely wrong. But this mythos that tried to shape the vast majority of Confederates into this good moral category was called The Lost Cause, really enforced by an 1866 book that tried to really recast the whole entire Confederacy as fighting for states' rights and not for slavery, which is not historically correct. Interesting enough, as they accept or try to reshape themselves into the anti-federalist movement, most of the anti-federalists of the American Revolution at one time suggested abolition. So it's a really convoluted way of doing propaganda because they never addressed the fact that there were several men that would have wanted to end slavery. Just the difficulty of how. Next slide, please. So the capstone or the greatest work of Ezekiel, Moses Ezekiel's career was the New South, which the Confederates, there were some Confederate graves at Arlington. The Confederate veterans were really upset that they had headstones in Arlington that resembled either civilians or slaves or former enslaved people. So they petitioned the government to make a separate Confederate graveyard at Arlington. So all these Confederate graves were reinterred into a singular grave site at Arlington. And then this monument was commissioned for it. And at the bottom of that monument is an inscription in Latin, which a lot more people would have understood during the era because the education. It's a quote from Lucan that says, the victorious God or the Union pleased the gods, but the losing side would have pleased Cato. And there's a lot of controversy about what that truly means. And the recasting of the Confederacy is kind of this noble cause that was lost when it really wasn't. Moses Ezekiel would have been 69 when this would have been commissioned. So most of the Confederate soldiers would have been dead at the time. The last of the surviving Confederates at the time probably lived miserable lives. This was the bloodiest war in American history. The South was absolutely destroyed in this war. Part of me wants to have compassion and say, well, maybe we let old men believe that their best friends and their brothers didn't die for vain. That might be just sympathy I have for like my father's generation or maybe my own generation facing the wars in Vietnam or Iraq. Like I have a classman that's buried up in Arlington, and I would like to one day say that, hey, he died fighting for America and the virtuous cause. Maybe the war wasn't justified, but he fought with courage and valor. So there's a real question of, can we allow that just for some small mercy for a memory of dying soldiers? Certainly how that's going to be used in the later generations, that becomes a different problem set. Yes, like Frederick Douglass, he believed that the war was fought singularly for slavery. And we have this very complicated challenge of taking a look at history and realizing people see different things. And maybe this is Stoicism in itself, is we constantly have to reflect to see, do we have the correct view of reality or not? Like, are we framing reality correctly as we move forward? And what does that mean to the people around us? Next slide. So because of the events in Charlottesville and the death with white supremacy rallies, the family of Ezekiel, 20 members of them, wrote an op-ed in 2017 asking for this monument to be removed as it is a piece of Confederate propaganda. Moses Ezekiel himself said it was propaganda, what's displayed on that memorial. But Moses Ezekiel wrote it built it as counter propaganda against works like Harriet Beecher Stowe that collected the worst accounts of slavery in the South and tried to make it seem like every account of slavery was this collection of worst accounts. The question is, who gets the lie in history and how do we interpret that? And if I lie on the extreme side here and I lie on the extreme side there and citizens see these both extreme lies, does that somehow balance out the reality? We're not sure. Essentially, Congress would recommend that this gets removed, and then in December of 2023, this monument would be removed. The base of the monument would remain because they didn't want to disturb graves. It would be put into storage, and then the new administration has ordered it to be restored back to its original position, given a $10 million restoration. We also have legislations going on in the state of Virginia right now, VMI, looking at whether VMI is falsely supporting the lost cause with their memorial of the Battle of New Market every year. There's very real questions of, hey, can we honor these people for what they did in the good aspects of it without honoring the bad causes? And there's a question here, is can we separate Cato from the lost cause, which is questionable. Next slide. So we've lost our knowledge of Cato and of the Stoics, mainly because we had shifts in our education models starting in the 1880s. So we've abandoned classical languages in our schools because we don't think they're practical enough. So you don't read Plutarch anymore, you don't read Lucan, you don't read Cicero in the original Latin. So these stories have been largely lost, and there's a question of whether they should be. Because of neo-Stoicism and its relation to Christian theology, there's a big push to separate church and state. So that's another reason why you aren't being exposed to these type of materials. We have removed the knightly education aspect of education. So we think that if we don't train you for warfare, you won't go to war, which I would ask you, has America been at peace since the 1880s? And the answer there is no, so that doesn't work, but we'll still try it. Next slide. So this is the questions I'll leave you here today with, is do we need a Cato? Do we not need kind of the imagery of a fierce opposition to tyranny, someone that has Stoic moral discipline, someone that defends Republican institutions and the courage to do one's duty? And without Cato, we lose the moral vocabulary of resisting tyranny. It weakens our philosophical roots of a limited government. We lose the symbol or cultural symbol of courage, and the American anti-federalist movement loses a key part of their intellectual heritage. So the question I'll leave you today is, what are you going to do with the memory or image of Cato? So thank you.
So wonderful. We will discuss on Thursday. Please stay if you have any questions, and I'm so glad you know all that.